What a game Dead Space was, and what massive boots they were to fill when developers Motive set about remaking the 2008 horror classic. They made a pretty good job of it too, mostly with one issue that sadly plagues the game through its entirety, but ultimately, it's a remake that doesn't completely reinvent the game like the Resident Evil remakes do. The experience still feels very close to the original while refining and adding features that simply improve on what was already a heart-pounding and bone-chilling experience. Whenever I think of Dead Space, I not only think about how I can turn my gun sideways like some kind of intergalactic gangster, but I also remember there's an actual pragmatic use for turning your gun on its side, to see those hideous alien creatures crapping their pants whenever they'd see me flip my plasma cutter on its side.
Hey, God! No, he turned it sideways. Kill shot! Kitchen! It's a kill shot!
Thankfully, so much of what made the original Dead Space a genuine classic was carried over into the remake. The player is still continually kept on their toes with some predictable and some less predictable jump scares, with those dog rough, naked, wannabe Slendermen aliens with swords for arms popping up all over the place. Except in the remake, encounters with these monstrosities are dynamic, meaning they won't appear in the same place for every playthrough and are even tied to how you're playing. I think this was a great idea, and particularly for players familiar with the original who know exactly when and where the jump scares appear. Obviously that impact is lost on certain moments, but now if you're playing well or you've been exploring an area for a certain amount of time, then just as you're starting to feel at ease, living off the nostalgic fumes of the original, a freakish alien can burst out of nearby vents at any moment, keeping even the hard-nosed Dead Space veterans on their toes. Plenty of the original's best combat features make its way into the remake as well, like Isaac's ability to stomp a mud hole in every alien's ass before asking them to walk it dry. Even Stone Cold himself would be impressed. I always loved the weapon variety in the original too. Each weapon now has to be found rather than purchased, which was nice, and each of the original Dead Space weapons had such a drastically differing feel to the next, and thankfully that's been carried over as well. Not only have the mechanics been refined to provide an even greater level of satisfaction when successfully detaching the alien limb of your choice, but weapon upgrades have been added too. Finding schematics will add a new upgrade to each weapon's skill tree, which, like the original, can be purchased with nodes, and these upgrades add another layer to the combat, such as the plasma cutter can continuously burn enemies, or the Ripper's saw blades can ricochet, doing damage to any grotesque extraterrestrial that's in the room. The story has received a few logical and very minor tweaks that coincide with certain objectives, but nothing too dramatic. The core of the narrative remains the same, taking the reins of Isaac Clarke, who is now a voiced protagonist and is performed really well too. The year is 2508, I'm guessing that's how the future folk will say it anyway. It could be 2508, it could be 2508, it could be 2508. I suppose we're going to find out in 485 years. Humans on planet Earth are clinging on to dear life due to a shortage of resources. I can't say that. Shortage of resources. And to counter this, huge spaceships known as planet crackers are sent to barren planets to harvest resources. Isaac and his engineering crew are sent out to repair the USG Ishimura, but as they approach, they notice that some silly sausage has turned all the bloody lights off on the Ishimura. Shock, horror, the lights being off is no accident at all, and Isaac and his crew are met with a very non-human welcome on the Ishimura, and the story unravels from there. I loved the narrative. It was never anything outlandish or something you haven't seen already, but the new script and vocal performances take the atmosphere to another creepier level, just ticking all the boxes you want ticking for an alien action horror game. One aspect of the original Dead Space they thankfully did away with was that god-awful and abysmally clunky asteroid shooting minigame section. Instead, Isaac is now tasked to manually turn on each turret, but the turrets auto-lock and fire the asteroids with a simple point-and-click system instead this time. This might sound like a detraction from the original, but this is one of the many sections of the game where you can make use of the new zero-gravity controls that are fairly fun to control as well. A similar feel to Prey's zero-gravity controls, except Isaac is much more limited in terms of the space you can float around in and the obvious third-person camera angle. It's certainly more fun than the original zero-gravity controls and more towards Dead Space 2 instead of Isaac leaping from designated points, giving far more control to the player, and in true Dead Space fashion, it's all complemented by the atmosphere thanks to the muffled audio and empty silences associated with outer space and zero gravity. Backtracking through previously visited areas on the Ishimura play a much bigger role in the overall experience in the remake as well, and this is founded on a new security level clearance system, with Isaac being granted higher security clearance as the story progresses, gaining access to new rooms and containers, as well as an optional side quest that will grant Isaac the Master Override clearance, which also gives Isaac access to some much needed loot on his mission to survive. You'll have noticed I mentioned optional side quests just then as well. Side quests weren't part of the original's experience, but a very welcomed and well written addition to the remake. As you can see, the remake takes the same over-the-shoulder third-person approach as the original that was often likened to the original Resident Evil 4 that was released way back in 2005 and was clearly and even openly known as the inspiration behind Dead Space, though in the remake there's a very subtle and much needed increase to the FOV, pulling the camera a little further back from Isaac's back without breaking the immersion in the process. The bleak metallic corridors are tense, dingy and claustrophobic, with flickering lights and unnerving shadows peering around corners as Isaac trundles his way through the Ishimura. The movement of Isaac still feels grounded, although the sprint button has shifted to the more modern left stick input instead. This slower character feel is such a classic and often underappreciated aspect of horror games, because I would hardly call the sprint button a sprint. It's more of a light jog. In fact, I wouldn't even call it a light jog either, because that suit looks heavy as shit. Isaac's movement and a lot of other similar games have that much slower feel to the character's movement, and this breeds fear, that helplessness and grounded reality due to the enemies being as quick and often quicker than you. The speed of your character can often make or break a horror game for me. You might have noticed I haven't called Dead Space a survival horror yet, because I don't believe it is. We're afforded such a wide arsenal of deadly alien obliterating weapons, and ammunition is pretty plentiful, which isn't very survival horror-esque. This differs depending on your difficulty setting of course, but not by much. The need for running away is minimal, and as you'd expect, you're rewarded with an inventory packed full of ammo if you maintain your accuracy and composure. Dead Space is a formidably disturbing experience, in particular for first-time players, and the audio, it's a work of art. It really is incredible, and definitely one of those experiences that you can heighten the experience yourself by switching the lights off and sticking a good set of headphones on. The noises you'll hear are bone-chilling, from a woman's faint whispering in a toilet to the tapping of claws that can be heard in a vent above your head. It creates such a terrifying atmosphere that resonates with me. The gameplay in terms of mechanics isn't something that'll blow anybody away, and that was the case in 2008 as well, but the gameplay acts as a cornerstone to the atmosphere that's complemented by the minimalistic HUD, the stalking fear factor, and the immersive plot-twisting storyline. The other major and most obvious difference between the original and the remake is of course the graphical fidelity. It looks incredible, in particular the suit, otherwise known as a rig, that Isaac wears. Unfortunately though, the ray tracing doesn't offer that much impact, and the FSR and DLSS isn't implemented that well either if you're playing on PC in particular and you plan to mix that with the motion blur. I can't speak to console, but from what I've heard and read, it performs really well on consoles with the noticeable drop in native native resolution, but I'd rather that than the stutter that plagues the entire game from start to finish. It's pretty much baked into the game with it running on DX12, and only by rebuilding my shaders, by deleting the cache folder manually, could I alleviate these stutters, but they'd soon return when exploring the Ishimura. And all of these stutters are a byproduct of reducing load times. Personally, I'd rather have a smooth gameplay experience in the occasionally hidden loading time, and this is something that's becoming a rapidly growing problem in a lot of modern day PC games, but that's a topic for another day. Regardless of the stutter though, they certainly weren't that frequent enough to hamper the overall experience, and that's an experience that I'd be truly jealous of if you're about to dive into Dead Space for the very first time. If you'd like to support Respawn, I've dropped my Patreon in the description, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Dead Space remake and how it compares to the original in particular. I'll see you in the next one.